and which doesn't necessarily refer to something in the world, but the kind of principle of the Enlightenment. And third, scientific method, where he means applying reason to reality by testing it, and it's a communal process again, right? And so in these five things in that format, I think would be that approval is what Peirce means by tenacity. Oral tradition is certainly what he means in this context by authority. And faith is a kind of intermediate term between approval and oral tradition. It's what makes one willing to agree to oral tradition. The personal approval one gives to oral tradition. So it's a transitional term in Peirce's way of thinking about this. The reason cogitation clearly refers to what he means by reason, right? And the reflective acceptance of a view is something which is kind of between reason, apparently, and what he means by scientific method. It's not the full scientific method because it's not a matter of clear experimentation and discussion of reproducible results and all of that, but it's sort of on that way, and it's not just thinking about a single proposition, but apparently a number of different ways of viewing one thing, right? Of viewing a particular question, and so it's a kind of precursor of scientific method, I think. But I think that's how the things would line up in the two
so it seems to me
ways
that
of thinking. Yes.
Akara, Parivitaka, the fourth one here, is not purely a priori reasoning, but Akara seems to mean things that appear. So it seems to be based on bits and pieces of evidence, but then one reflects on those things that one observes and then reaches conclusions, which may or may not be valid.
Right.
Okay, but I want to move on now. So.
Okay.
Okay, so we have we have approval or preference, oral tradition, reason cogitation, reflective acceptance of a view. So again, in each case, we're just taking the last one, one preserves truth when one says, my reflective acceptance of a view is thus, but he does not come to the definite conclusion, only this is true, anything else is wrong. So I would say that the general conclusion or generalization that one can make from this passage is that one preserves the truth when one states the source of one's belief. Well, let us say one states the content of one's belief, one states the source of it, but one doesn't jump to the conclusion that what one believes is definitely and infallibly the truth. Okay, so then the Buddha, in a way, he's leading Bharadvaja on with the concluding sentence of this paragraph. He says, in this way, there is the preservation of truth. In this way, one preserves truth. In this way, we describe the preservation of truth. But as yet, there is no discovery of truth. And the expression that's used here is such anubodha. So satya is the truth, And then Anubodha it's based on the stem is Bodha, which means understanding, awakening, realization, but here discovery. And so that Anubodha would imply a direct personal insight into the truth. And so when the Buddha says this, then it, in a sense, it elicits from Bharadvaja the question, how, Master Gotama, is there the discovery of truth? In what way does one discover truth? I'm asking about the discovery of truth. And so now the Buddha is going to describe the whole process or approach to realization that takes place in his own teaching. Okay, so he says, here, Bharadvaja, a bhikkhu may be living in dependence on some village or town. And even though it's referring here, it uses the word bhikkhu, which ordinarily means a Buddhist monk, but it seems that this is referring to the Buddha himself. This is going to be explaining how somebody investigates the Buddha, gains confidence in him, and then practices his teaching. Okay, so a bhikkhu may be living in dependence on some village or town. Then a householder or a householder's son goes to him and investigates him in regard to three kinds of states. States rooted in greed, states rooted in hatred, states based on or rooted in delusion. And so he does so with the question in mind, in this Venerable One, this teacher, are there any states based on greed, based on hatred, based on delusion, such that not knowing, he might say, I know? Well, let's just stick with greed, okay? Are there any states based on greed, such that with his mind obsessed by those states, while not knowing, he might say, I know? Or while not seeing, he might say, I see? Or he might urge others to act in a way that would lead to their harm and suffering for a long time. And then as he investigates, he comes to know that there are no states based on greed in this Venerable One. The bodily behavior and verbal behavior of this Venerable One are not those of one influenced or motivated by greed. So usually, in order to detect states of greed, one has to base oneself on a person's bodily behavior or speech. Normally, one wouldn't expect a normal person to have the ability to directly see into the minds of others. So the criterion that one has to work with is observation of a person's behavior, their bodily actions, their verbal actions. So if the teacher says, give to me, give me a lot of donations, then you could see that it's manifesting greed. Or if, when a lot of food is put out for him, of course some people have different physical needs, but if you see that he's constantly eating more than a normal person's capacity, and going especially for delectable foods, well then you could see that there's some greed for taste present. And so this is setting very high standards, so you shouldn't think that I'm going to examine every Buddhist monk or Buddhist nun in this way. Then if you see that there are little traces of greed or anger, therefore, you come to the conclusion that this person is a hypocrite, or that the Buddha's teaching must be wrong. But you could just see that ordinary monks and nuns still have human faults, and so one could just accept their faults, but judge on the basis of their intention, the direction in which they're steering themselves. But here, it seems one is actually seeking out a spiritual teacher. And my supposition is that this text was originally formulated with reference to the Buddha himself. You know, somebody examining the Buddha with the question whether he's worthy of trust. Okay, so one could see from the person's behavior whether they have bodily behavior, verbal behavior, whether they have greed or hatred, whether they have delusion. That's very difficult to tell from the bodily behavior. But if a person puts one pair of glasses over another, okay, so the bodily behavior, verbal behavior are the basis for making judgments about greed. Then the second criterion is the teaching that that person teaches. And so one hears the teaching, and then the one who's examining comes to the conclusion that the Dhamma that this Venerable One is teaching is profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise. So this kind of Dhamma is not easily taught by one affected by greed. Okay, so then one examines the person in a similar way with regard to hatred and in regard to delusion. And in each case, one sees that the person's behavior doesn't display signs of delusion, and the person is teaching a Dhamma which is not easily taught by one subject to delusion. Okay, so now we come to paragraph 20. So now it says, when the householder has investigated him and seen that he is purified from states based on delusion, then he places faith in him. But one has to say also that there's something a little bit circular here, that one places faith in him, and what is the subject of that faith that one is placing in him? Well, it's the faith that this one is free from greed, hatred, and delusion. Because again, this is something one can't know definitely for oneself, but it's an inference that one draws based on the person's behavior. Person's behavior and the quality of his teaching. And so one places faith, what I would say is, one places faith in the teacher as one who is himself free from greed, hatred, and delusion. And I'd say one also places faith in the teaching as a teaching that is capable of, we could express this as leading one to the end of one's own greed, hatred, and delusion. Or we could say a teaching which is capable of promoting one's true well-being and happiness. Or else we could say a teaching capable of leading one to the realization of truth. So we could put this in a number of ways, but it seems it's important to clarify exactly what one is placing faith in. faith, the way I see it, one places faith in the teacher and faith in the capacity or potential of the teaching. Anybody else have something to say about that? To add to this? Okay, then we'll continue. Okay, so when one has done this investigation and placed faith, then, I'm in paragraph section 20 now, filled with faith, one visits him and pays respect to him. This is the traditional Indian way of receiving teachings from a spiritual teacher. One doesn't, ask what are the books published by this teacher, because teachings were not, there were no books on spiritual teachings. But one will hear the teacher maybe give public discourses, and now if one wants to get personal teaching from the teacher, one will go to visit him personally. And one goes, when one visits the teacher, one pays respect to him with a humble mind, because it's said in Indian tradition that the humble mind is like an empty cup which can receive water or tea, whereas a mind which is proud, somebody full of their own ideas, arrogant, conceited, they come to see a teacher, and usually they're coming just to argue, to debate, and so they're coming with a mind which is already filled with water. Like a cup filled with water, if you pour water into it, the water will just overflow. So you pay respect, then pay respect, one gives ear, which means one might pose some questions, or just ask for some advice, some instruction. Then when the teacher speaks, one gives ear, and by giving ear, it says he hears the Dhamma. Having heard the Dhamma, maybe he memorizes it, is a little strong, better. He retains it in mind. It doesn't mean that you are immediately memorizing the way you would memorize a poem, but you have to retain or preserve the teaching in mind so that you'll be able to sort of take it home with you in order to investigate it. So when he has retained the teachings in mind, then when he leaves the teacher and goes back into his own residence, he examines the meaning of the teaching. So he'll reflect on the teaching, examine it from different points of view, consider whether this is cogent, that is cogent, whether it's coherent, whether the teachings hold together, whether they're valid or applicable in terms of one's own life. And so then, as one is examining the meaning, then at a certain point, one gains what is called here a reflective acceptance of those teachings. This is Dhamma Nijjhana Kanti. So we could see here already several factors have been mentioned which correspond to the sources of knowledge mentioned in those 5 sources of knowledge mentioned in the earlier part of the sutta. We see that when the disciple is approaching the teacher, he places faith in him. So we have faith as, say, a source of knowledge. Even though it's not stated explicitly, but we could assume that the disciple has developed a certain ruchi, a liking towards the teacher. In this case, maybe anusava isn't so relevant, since we're not accepting a teaching that's come down from generation to generation, like the Brahmins. But there is a listening. Actually, we can say that listening is involved here, giving ear. seems to correspond to anusava, to hearing what is being transmitted. Then one examines the meaning of the teaching. That seems to correspond to akara parivitako, reasoned reflection. And then now one gains an acceptance of the teaching based upon one's reflection. So that corresponds to the reflective acceptance of a view. So basically we could say all of those 5 sources of information or grounds for belief are also present in the process of gaining insight according to the Buddha's system. Okay, but now having gained a reflective acceptance of those teachings, one doesn't just remain content with that acceptance, but now zeal springs up. Or actually, I prefer the word chanda. Well, the Pali word is chanda. I prefer to translate this desire. This would be a desire to attain the goal, or a desire to experience the truth of the teachings. Okay, so when zeal springs up, then one applies the will, or one makes an effort, one exerts oneself. Then, exerting oneself, one scrutinizes. And there's a question, what is the difference between scrutinizing and examining the meaning? According to the commentary says, he investigates things in terms of impermanence and so forth. So in terms of the 3 marks of impermanence, suffering and non-self, or in terms of dependent origination. And then I ventured the opinion here that says that this stage seems to be that of insight contemplation. So it seems that in the stage of examining the meaning, one is tackling the teaching intellectually with using one's powers of reasoning to examine the teaching. But at the stage of scrutinization, one is not so much scrutinizing the teachings themselves, but rather scrutinizing one's own experience, using the teachings, the Dhamma, as a guideline to investigation. Okay, so then it says, having scrutinized, he strives. And then in my note, I pointed out that exerting the will, which was applying the will mentioned earlier, and striving, both seem very similar, almost synonymous. So to make sense of why these 2 stages are mentioned separately, it seems that applying the will is exerting oneself, maybe an earlier stage of exerting oneself. I say that it can be understood as the exertion prior to insight contemplation, whereas striving would be the exertion that matures or develops insight. Okay, so this is striving, in the deep, more advanced stages of the practice. And then resolutely striving, here the text uses an interesting expression. It says, he realizes with the body the supreme truth, and he sees it by penetrating it with wisdom. So the supreme truth here is parama satya, that is the ultimate truth, which is not truth as a proposition, but this is nibbana or nirvana, which is the unconditioned element, the deathless element. And it said that he realizes this with the body. Kayena sachi karoti. And what's meant by the body here, or at least the way I understand it, it's not that the physical body realizes nirvana, but I take the experience to be so powerful that it's like one's whole person is involved in that realization. The commentary says that what's meant by body is namakaya, the mental body, the collection of mental factors. But to my mind, that seems to dilute the full meaning, or to weaken the full meaning of the expression. I take it to be like a very powerful personal experience, so that it's so powerful it's as if the body itself is undergoing this transformative experience. So one realizes the supreme truth with the body and sees it by penetrating it with wisdom. Wisdom here is panya, and the function of wisdom in relation to the truth is to penetrate it. I think it uses the word atividya, which comes from the verb vidati, which means to pierce through, to shoot an arrow through a target. And so then the Buddha says, in this way, Bharadvaja, there is the discovery of truth. In this way, one discovers truth. In this way, we describe the discovery of truth. But as yet, there is no final arrival at truth. And the word that means final arrival at truth, or maybe better, full attainment of truth, this is Satya Anupatti. So Satya again is truth. Anupatti, well, the word patti usually means. Okay, so in Sach Anupatti, okay. Yes. Satya is truth, then anupatti, well, it's based on the stem is the word patti, which means attainment. In Sanskrit, prapti. Anybody know Sanskrit? The word prapti is quite common in Sanskrit philosophical literature. It becomes in Pali patti, anupatti, similar in meaning. So it's the attainment of truth. And it's not quite clear, the sutta doesn't explicitly distinguish what is the difference between discovery or penetration of or understanding of truth and the full attainment of truth or full arrival at truth. Somehow one believes that there must have been some fuller explanation at the time of the discourse of the distinction between these ideas. It's just sort of left tacitly understood for us to figure out. The way I would understand it is by reference to, the 4 stages of awakening, 4 stages of enlightenment. So we have the first stage is the stage of stream entry, or sotapatti. Yeah, so the stage of stream entry is the first stage of awakening, where one sees the truth of the Dhamma for the very first time. One sees the Four Noble Truths completely. One directly sees the third Noble Truth, Nibbana, as the cessation of suffering. And with that, one fully understands the first Noble Truth of suffering. One begins the process of eradicating the defilements. And with the attainment of stream entry, the Noble Eightfold Path comes into being so that one can never fall away from it. So the stream enterer is one who has seen the truth of the Dhamma, realized the ultimate truth, but has not yet reached the end of the path. The stream enterer still has to continue cultivating the factors of the path. As he cultivates, he'll reach the second stage called once returning. At the stage of stream enterer, one can never fall away, but one is subject to at most 7 more rebirths, either in the human world or in the heavenly realms. So to reach the end, to reach the final goal, one still has to cultivate further. So the stream enterer will continue to cultivate. As he cultivates, he reaches the stage of once returning, where he's bound to return only one more time to the human or heavenly realms. Then the stage of non-returning, the third stage, where he doesn't return to the human realm or to the lower heavenly realms, but he'll take rebirth in one of the super divine realms and reach final liberation there. But if he goes further, then he reaches arhatship, which means the eradication of all the defilements, the complete understanding of the truth and eradication of all the defilements. So I would understand the distinction between the discovery of truth and the full arrival at truth to be the distinction between stream entry and arhatship. Okay, so the sutta goes on. The young Brahmin asks, okay, so the Buddha says, as yet there is no final arrival at truth. So now the young Brahmin picks up on that statement of the Buddha and asks, in what way is there the final arrival at truth? In what way does one finally arrive at truth? We ask Master Gotama about the final arrival at truth. And so the Buddha doesn't add anything new here, but he says the final arrival at truth occurs through the repetition, development, and cultivation of those same things. In this way, there is the final arrival at truth, and so on. So, in order to arrive at the complete realization of truth, one goes through the same process. One doesn't have to depend upon the earliest stages, but one already has the reflective acceptance of the teachings, and one has direct insight into the teachings. And so what one has to do is continue to strive resolutely, scrutinizing or examining things with the insight that one has already acquired. So one goes on striving diligently, using the insight wisdom of insight into impermanence, suffering, and non-self. And then as one cultivates those factors again and again, the insight cuts deeper and deeper until one reaches the ultimate attainment. Okay, so now when the Buddha makes that statement, then the Brahmin student asks the Buddha, what is most helpful for final arrival of truth? I'm asking about what is most helpful for final arrival of truth. And now the Buddha just goes through, we actually go through the same sequence of stages, except it's going in reverse order, from striving back to scrutiny, from scrutiny to application of the will, going all the ways back, I'm skipping over this, to we come eventually back to section 30. What is most helpful for, actually we go back further to, okay, we'll go to 30. What is most helpful for hearing the Dhamma? So what is most helpful for hearing the Dhamma is giving ear, or in other words, listening. What is most helpful for listening? Paying respects. What is most helpful for paying respects? Visiting the teacher is most helpful. What is most helpful for visiting? What is the motivation for visiting? And then faith is most helpful for visiting. So if faith does not arise, one will not visit the teacher, but because there is faith, then one goes to visit him. So you see, even though the Buddha, in the early part of the discourse, he rejects the claim of the Brahmins who are basing everything upon faith, faith in the line of teachers. But here the Buddha is tracing the whole process of cultivation back to faith. So one has faith in the teacher, one visits him. When one visits, one listens to the teaching. But you see, even though everything starts with faith, but it doesn't stop with faith. But faith becomes, the starting point for this process of learning, inquiry, investigation, diligent effort, and then insight and realization. Okay, now paragraph 34, interesting paragraph. So the Brahmin student now says, we asked Master Gotama about the preservation of truth, and Master Gotama answered, and I accept his teaching and I'm satisfied. Then we asked Master Gotama about the discovery of truth, and the Master Gotama answered, and I'm satisfied. Then we asked Master Gotama about the final arrival of truth. He answered, and I'm satisfied with his answer. We asked about the things most helpful for final arrival of truth, and Master Gotama answered, and I'm satisfied with his answer. And now he admits, he says, formerly, Master Gotama, we used to think, who are these bald-pated recluses, these swarthy, menial offspring of the kinsman's feet, that they would understand the Dharma? So, in making that statement, he's expressing a view of the samanas widely held by the Brahmins. I think last week I spoke about how there was this, almost at times, a kind of rivalry or an antagonism between the Brahmin community and the culture of the Shramanas, the world renounces, the ascetics. And so the Brahmins spurned, even despised the Shramanas, because the Shramanas rejected the authority of the Vedas. They observed celibacy, which the Brahmins didn't, and they didn't acknowledge the class system which the Brahmins were trying to impose. And so here, young Bharadvaja is showing the kind of attitude that the Brahmins had. They would think about the Shramanas as baldy heads, as just being offspring of the kinsman's feet. Now the word kinsman, the word that's translated kinsman here is bandhu, and that is referring to Brahma, who is considered the all-powerful creator gods. And according to the Brahmins of this period, when Brahma created the world, he created the 4 social classes from different parts of his body. He created the Shudras, the workers, the laborers, the servants, the working class from his feet. He created the Vaishyas. The Vaishyas were the agriculture, the people who owned the farms, the pastoral